Senator from New Hampshire.
Mr. President, I ask that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Thank you. I also ask unanimous consent to extend morning business until 5:30 p.m., with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
Thank you. Mr. President, we have now almost a 9% unemployment rate in this country. I think the good news is that unemployment dropped to 8.9%. But it's still way too high. We have a $1.6 trillion deficit. And yet, despite these enormous challenges, Congress still has not passed a federal budget for this year. Our deadline to pass a 2011 appropriations bill was September 30th of last year. But Congress still has failed to meet that deadline. And last week, we passed our fifth, that's right, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, fifth short-term continuing resolution to keep the government open. At some point soon, I think maybe even this evening, I think we're going to be voting on the House Republicans' package of budget cuts that I believe threaten our economic recovery. And after moving on from that, we'll still need to pass another continuing resolution by the end of next week in order to avoid a government shutdown. Now, while we're debating these short-term continuing resolutions, in China and India and Germany, they're debating long-term investments in education, energy, technology, and research. Those are the decisions with the potential to shape the global economy for many decades to come. Meanwhile, here at home, we're fighting about whether we're going to keep the government open for 2 weeks. This kind of short-term budgeting isn't just hurting our future, it's hurting our economy today. Just last week, I heard from a company in New Hampshire about the effects of Congress's failure to pass a full-year budget. The company's called Nitro Security, and it's located in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And it's a company that's at the forefront of the emerging cybersecurity industry. And even in a difficult economy over the last couple of years, they were named one of the 600 fastest-growing private companies in the nation. Yet, despite most of their business coming from the private sector, Nitro Security also has significant contracts protecting data systems at the Department of Defense, NASA, and even the Food and Drug Administration. They should be creating jobs and helping to get our economy moving again. But because Congress can't conduct its business on time, their stalled contracts mean that they've not been able to hire new workers. We are missing out on these jobs because Washington's budget process is broken. Congress needs to do better. In the last 30 years, Congress has only completed the annual budget process on time twice, just 2 times in the last 30 years. That's a 7% success rate. Solving our long-term deficit problems and reinvigorating our economy is going to require tough choices, but we're never going to be able to make these choices until we change the way Washington does business. That's why I've joined Senator Isaacson in proposing the Biennial Budgeting and Appropriations Act to bring sorely needed oversight and long-term planning to the federal budget process. Our legislation would dedicate the first year of a Congress to appropriating federal dollars and devote the second year to scrutinizing federal programs to determine if they're working and deserve continued funding. Because of annual budgeting, members of Congress don't have the time we need to conduct careful, thorough reviews of federal programs. And federal agency staff are required to dedicate countless hours every year to preparing the budget and to explaining what they do, rather than accomplishing critical missions. As a result, we continue to spend money on projects that are duplicative, sometimes failing, and often no longer useful. In fact, just last week, the Government Accountability Office released a landmark report on government duplication and overlap. The report reveals that in as many as 34 different areas across the federal government. Agencies are offering overlapping services to similar populations. Now, as we think about how we need to address our debt and deficit, we should begin by eliminating these kinds of duplicative programs. That's the type of reform we should be considering. We should be eliminating duplication and making targeted cuts and investments in our future. We should be making investments in projects like the Memorial Bridge, which connects New Hampshire and Maine and is a critical economic engine for the seacoast region of New Hampshire and Maine and the shipyard that is so vital to making sure that we can upgrade the ships in our Navy. Now, even though this bridge has been recognized as a national priority and it enjoys support from the Maine and New Hampshire Senate delegations, the project to replace the bridge is being threatened by ill-considered, reckless cuts in the House of Representatives' continuing resolution. These are the consequences of short-term budgetary thinking. They're penny-wise and pound-foolish. In another example we have in New Hampshire, the Bureau of Prisons has recently completed construction of a federal prison in the North Country of New Hampshire in a community called Berlin, and it cost $276 million. As the construction was wrapping up, the Bureau of Prisons requested activation funding for fiscal year 2011 to hire rank-and-file officers and begin getting this prison ready to open. But because we're operating on this short-term continuing resolution that fails to account for these types of situations, we now have a state-of-the-art $276 million prison that's just sitting vacant. We have a warden who's there, who's waiting to hire staff. And the Bureau of Prisons needs the 1,280 inmate beds that this facility will provide. The community needs the $40 million annual economic impact from this prison and the 340 jobs that this facility will provide. But none of these important objectives are being met because our budget process is not working. Instead, the Bureau of Prisons is spending $4 million a year to maintain an empty building. As members of Congress, we're entrusted with the responsibility of spending taxpayer dollars wisely. Our current budget and spending process makes it all too easy for waste and inefficiency to remain hidden. And at the same time, important priorities are neglected by the whims of a chaotic annual budgeting process. Switching to biennial budgeting won't solve all of our problems, but it would certainly be an important step toward greater oversight, increased accountability, and a more responsible government. Thank you very much, Mr. President. I yield the floor.